Hi guys! Welcome to the Ancient Monkey YouTube channel. So before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, also subscribe to my channel. In this video, we will talk about the financial and economic crisis in developing countries. So make sure to watch the full video. Developing countries were hit hard by the financial and economic crisis, although the impact was somewhat delayed. Every country had different challenges to master. The closer the developing countries are interconnected with the world economy, the crasser the effects. And the incipient recovery that is becoming noticeable is, for the time being, restricted to only a few countries and regions. The crisis was transmitted primarily by trade and financial flows, forcing millions back into poverty. Attainment of the Millennium Development Goals is seriously jeopardized in many countries. Many developing countries did not and do not have the resources to stimulate the economy and protect their socially disadvantaged populations to the same extent as the industrialized countries. However, many countries have made considerable efforts to mitigate the effects. Developing countries have also increased their cooperation with one another and are urgently demanding a greater voice in global economic affairs. The industrialized countries are for the most part more concerned with their own problems. Their readiness to provide more extensive aid is limited. They are under pressure from the international institutions to relax their previous dominance in favor of the increasingly strong emerging countries. A shift in power and influence that was already noticeable before the financial crisis is deepening. 1. Introduction. 1. The worldwide measures to deal with the gravest economic crisis since the Great Depression in the 1930s began to show the first signs of recovery in late summer and early autumn 2009. Most predictions are still cautious. Thus, immediately prior to the meeting of the Group of 20 G20 Ministers of Finance in London at the beginning of September, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, was concerned that the recovery was both fragile and slow-moving. He warned against growth without employment and against discontinuing the economic stimulation programs too early, and he also demanded coordinated measures on an international plane. Strauss-Kahn, 2009. 2. The various predictions, particularly for China, India, Brazil, Japan, and a few other Asian countries, were optimistic. The United Nations, UN, Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean also predicted a return to positive growth in 2010. But by far, not all the countries and regions reported a brightening of the economic prospects in early autumn. The crisis is by no means over for the majority of the developing and transition countries. 3.2. Effects of the crisis on the developing and transition countries. The crisis originated in the major financial centers in the developed countries. The force of impact on the developing and transition countries became apparent only gradually. The situation is new. Previous crises spread from the developing countries. This time developing countries are the victims of the crisis, but they did not cause it. The causes of the global financial crisis are to be found in the financial and economic policies of the developed countries, primarily the United States, US. Developing countries are not responsible for it, but they are now seriously affected, wrote Martin Kor, the new director of the South Center in Geneva. The Third World Network, 2008, reported that the UN Economic Commission for Asia and the Pacific had in fact registered a phase of heightened instability, but at that time they reduced their growth predictions only minimally. In the IMF July 2008 update of the Global Financial Stability Report, IMF GFSR, the IMF, for its part, registered a weakening of growth in the threshold countries and a heightened risk of inflation. Borrowing abroad became more expensive. Investors had become more risk-conscious, but the IMF still characterized the threshold countries as fairly crisis-resistant. The full force of the global financial and economic crisis impacted the developing and threshold countries in the course of 2008. Subsequently, the IMF, the World Bank, and other institutions continually downgraded their growth predictions for Asia, Latin America, and above all Africa. High growth rates disappeared, and many countries even had to put up with shrinking economic production. According to the IMF April 2009 World Economic Outlook, IMF WBO, the growth setbacks in the threshold and developing countries were higher than in the industrialized countries. Compared with their growth potential, the developing and threshold countries are therefore harder hit by the global financial and economic crisis than the industrialized countries that caused it. 7. The regression in economic growth entailed a sinking per capita income, at least in countries with high population growth rates. Macroeconomically, the crisis manifested itself in mounting deficits in trade and payment balances, dwindling currency reserves, currency devaluations, increasing rates of inflation, higher indebtedness, and soaring public budget deficits. This had a direct impact on the living conditions of the population. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, 2009, estimated that the fall in growth cost the 390 million poorest people in Africa. Those who must survive on the equivalent of USD 1 per day, a total of some USD 18 billion or USD 46 per person. This is equivalent to a drop in average per capita income of 1/5. The International Labor Organization, ILO, 2008, feared the number of unemployed could rise to some 50 million by the end of 2009. The imbalance is mounting. Shortly before the G20 meeting in Washington, in November 2008, the World Bank estimated that a fall in growth of 1% would force 20 million people into absolute poverty. World Bank 2008. 6 months later, the World Bank predicted that the number of poor would rise further in half the developing countries. Among the low-income countries, as many as 1/3, and in the countries south of the Sahara, as many as 3/4 would be affected. World Bank GMR 2009. This means that the Millennium Development Goals faded into the distance for many countries. As a consequence, there has already been social unrest in some countries. In its latest yearbook, the International Network Social Watch, 2009, reports, in numerous contributions by local civil society organizations, on how the crisis has subjectively affected individual countries. 3. Crisis transmission channels. 9. The crisis did not impact all regions, countries, and population groups equally or on the same time scale. The patterns developed differently for each country. On the other hand, the transmission channel patterns are clear. T. Veld 2008, IDS 2008, Toporowski 2009. The financial and economic crisis of the industrialized states spread to the developing countries primarily via financial flows and through trade. The closer a developing country is coupled with the global economy, the stronger and more rapid the impact of the crisis. 4. Responses to the crisis. 19. In the wealthy countries, the discussion on how to deal with the global financial and economic crisis marginalized the developing countries and their needs. At all events, the impact of the crisis on the poor countries did not hit the headlines the way bank bailouts and toxic securities did. 20. In recent years, many developing countries have made significant macroeconomic progress. Consequently, some of them are better armed against the crisis than they were on previous occasions. These countries are not exposed to the crisis without any protection whatever. Many governments in the developing countries have undertaken measures according to their own powers. They have strengthened their regional cooperation with one another. The UN, IMF, World Bank, and other international organizations have also endeavored to support the developing countries. They were urged to act by the non-governmental organizations and numerous academic powers. 5. Outlook and conclusions. 68. There is no doubt that one of the consequences of the financial and economic crisis was a shift in power and influence. The ascendance of the G20 at the cost of the G8 is irreversible. The larger threshold countries are demanding more influence. Brazil, China, India, and South Africa do not want to put up with a modest further shift of only 5% of voting rights. A renewed conflict is imminent. What do you think of our video? Let me know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button. Also subscribe to our channel before you go. Thank you for watching.